Welcome. Thanks for joining us. We will try and make this as informative and fast-moving and exciting as possible. There's no API limit to the questions, so you can ask as many as you want. So I'll start out and
You don't have to get a token for it?
No tokens either. It's just, wide open. As much as you want to hit it, it's totally fine. So my name is Charlie O'Donnell. I'm an EIR at First Round Capital, and I'll let the panelists give a very brief, pointed introduction to who they are and how they fit here.
Albert Wenger. I'm a VC at Union Square Ventures. We have a lot of companies that have APIs, and some of you may have built on some of the APIs, and we have a bunch of companies that are building on other people's APIs. So when we just yesterday had our portfolio summit, where we once a year bring together all the CEOs and founders from the portfolio companies, we spent well over an hour discussing APIs and whether to have them, how and how to build on them. So this is a topic that we care a lot about.
So I'm Christine Lemke. I'm one of the co-founders, and I'm the current COO of a company called Sense Networks. And the reason why I'm here is Sense Networks is essentially one big API, and that's pretty much it. We take boatloads of data in, usually location data or call data from the telco networks. We compute on it, and then we spit it back out in a more meaningful format for other people.
I'm Alex Iskold. I'm founder and CEO of New York startup Adaptive Blue, and we have an API, and we use a lot of APIs, so I guess that's why I'm here.
Todd Levy, one of the co-founders of Bitly. I head up product and engineering efforts, and obviously Bitly is kind of an integrated ecosystem play, so it relies very, very heavily on its API and the APIs of others.
So the interesting thing with your three companies at the end is having an API is core to your business. Your business really wouldn't exist if they didn't sort of plug into other people's data feeds or understand other people's data or contribute data but how do you sort of make the decisions early on, sort of outline what you're going to give access to? What types of questions do you have to ask early on in product development as you develop your own APIs?
Yeah, I would say personally, in this situation with Bitly, from the beginning, it wasn't so much a matter of asking questions, but not attempting to define too much of the product. We kind of realized very early on that our user base and the people who would integrate it and drive the growth and development of the product would oftentimes have a better sense of how the product would and could and should be used. So straight from the start, it was developed with a very open approach. Every URL is publicly accessible. The metrics and information around every URL are completely publicly accessible. And to some extent, we let the market kind of guide our focus and sharpen us. So for us, having that extremely open approach from the beginning was really good for helping us define the product rather than us attempting to define it for everybody else.
And what about you guys?
Well, I mean, for us, it's pretty much we have like most of the product is just accessible via the API. Whatever we can do, and we build our website and our add-on on top of our own API. So I'd say probably 80% of any kind of calls that we're making into the back end are the same as the public API, and then there's 20% stuff that we're not exposing, which is just mostly housekeeping. But the system overall is completely open and readable and writable via API.
So you're eating your own dog food?
We're eating our own dog food, yes.
And you, I would imagine, like, what is the breakup of, like, who's using your data? Is it sort of less consumer-facing? And you have businesses that are using your data.
Right. So we have big businesses using the data. I mean, we launched like a little consumer app just to demo the platform overall at one point. But really, our business is in the business-to-business space. And when we considered what data to expose, it was very clear from the data origination side. you're not allowed to expose specific information about consumers. And so part of the value we bring is we're abstracting that data. So you can never know a latitude and longitude and time fix of some person, but you might know that they're outdoorsy and that they like to go to outdoorsy places. So we had to abstract the level of data and also make sure that the abstractions were useful to advertisers. Those are the people that are, feeding off of our data right now. And even internally inside the telco, those guys are, segmenting users by these different behavioral attributes. So we had a very clear firewall between specific data and abstracted data.
So you had a concern basically that from a privacy and legal point of view, and also just from a user point of view as well, that people were not necessarily, and this is I'm sure a concern for a lot of people, what data did they agree to give you, and you're now making it accessible to other people, that there are natural limitations to how you want to expose that data to specific individuals.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely is a key consideration.
So out of the companies that are in your portfolio in terms of their API development, how does it usually go in terms of, do they start out with it in mind? Is it an afterthought and they sort of go back? Is it a way to kind of outsource business development?
I would say we kind of have three groups in the portfolio. There's a group of companies that, much like Bitly, launched from day one with an API. Probably the most notable one being Twitter. And I think Todd's observation, I think, is spot on, which is the whole point of an API is to have others develop use cases for you that you haven't thought of. And so if you restrict the API to specific use cases, you're kind of nuking the main reason to have one. So I think that's a very important point, is to make it in every which way underdetermined, not overdetermined. Then I would say we have a second group of companies that is gradually adding an API to what they have. An example of that is Etsy, which is slowly adding an API to the marketplace. That tends to be much harder because often your underlying architecture wasn't created in a way that makes it easy to add an API to it. So that can be a slow and somewhat painful process. And then we have some companies that are frankly still struggling with the idea, what should the API be, why should they have one, what's the business case for having one? And those are the ones that we're spending the most time with, because we're trying to convince them that there's a good, pretty much a good reason for everybody to have an API.
And we'll definitely get into that, but Todd, you touched upon getting product direction from how people use it. What happens when somebody builds on top of your API and it's something that is along your own product roadmap, and people start doing cool stuff with it, and you think that's something that we should be doing? Have anyone ever run into that case, and what is the interaction like between you and the person who's developing that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for us, there doesn't tend to be a lot of natural tension, and that might be somewhat particular to us, because we've somewhat conceived of it as a very distributed, accessible unit, right? The link itself, and it's trackable and shareable, driven through the API, and we kind of see our goal to let people do whatever they want with it, and to be able to use it in interesting different ways. We kind of go out of our way to help people access the data, to organize the data and store the data, but if other people are going to do that in interesting ways for us, that only serves to extend the utility of it for us. So we don't really see it as particularly competitive, but that again is somewhat particular to our case.
So I'll bring up an example of a company that you sit on the board of, Foursquare, and some people have used their APIs, for example, like Social Grade, which is a really interesting presentation of the Foursquare data, something that seems like it would be a natural evolution to show up in my own Foursquare account. And I think it's interesting that Foursquare always trumpets Social Grade as an interesting use of their data. And when I sometimes think, well, are you guys ever going to do that? And how does that work? And one day do you have to buy the folks that are doing interesting stuff with your data?
I think there's always a tension that people feel where they're worried that somebody's going to do something that competes using the API. I think in most cases, you're better off focusing on making your own product insanely great and not worrying about something that could happen 1 or 2 or 3 years down the road. In the specific case of Foursquare and SocialGrade, it's a perfect example of why you should have an API and why you should make it open. Foursquare is 2.5 engineers, 3 engineers right now. So there's a very, very, very finite limit to what they can build. And they certainly wouldn't have time to build the kind of data representations, et cetera, that SocialGrade is building. So if SocialGrade succeeds and gets that data out there, and it makes more people aware of Foursquare and they become Foursquare users, that can set up a virtuous circle. Now, I don't think the world is all pretty. I mean, there are definitely situations where a few years down the road, you may have some tough discussions around, okay, you deriving this much benefit from this, we're providing the data, et cetera. But I think, premature optimization is the root of all evil. So worrying about that now, sort of, while both businesses are tiny, one has no employees, the other has 3 employees, seems kind of the wrong time to be worrying about it.
Gotcha. So what are the concerns then? We'll talk about some of the benefits that you receive, but I mean, obviously there's sort of the technical challenge of just from an infrastructure standpoint, managing all that and, managing a number of essentially non-paying customers who have certain demands and stuff like that. I mean, what are some of the pitfalls of this from a technical standpoint?
I think you just need to kind of figure out, the boundaries between, what's going to be the API and what's going to be your production. In our case, we have separate servers servicing the API, so the only kind of common touching point is the Amazon Web Services, where basically the database where data is stored. So all of the dynamic EC2 instances are separate. So we kind of draw the line there, and you kind of have reasonable amount of control. You can monitor IP addresses, and you can our API doesn't require you to have developer key, but we can kind of block people based on their IPs and so forth. And it hasn't really been a problem, but I think you just have to have it definitely is extra work. Like you have to think about it and kind of figure out a good infrastructure for doing that, but it's not that bad.
Gotcha. Now, does anybody use any infrastructure tools to sort of manage their API, like a sort of Mashery or any?
3Scale.
What was it?
3Scale. That's another one.
3Scale. Is anybody using any of those tools? Or
We looked at them and we decided not to go with them at this point. We just thought that it was actually, quite frankly, unnecessarily expensive for us. So we figured that we don't need it, but there's a pretty big benefit to using them. I mean, they provide kind of tiered level of services. So like, for example, if you want to have developer keys, if you want to track the usage for each developer, if you want to provide specific, security layers, there's definite benefit to using these solutions, but we just felt like we're not at the point where we needed them.
I see Dan Cantor in the room, who worked at Delicious when I was there, and one thing that can happen to you if you have an open API, you can generate more access and more traffic very rapidly on your API than on your main site. I think it's fairly well known that Twitter does, the vast percentage of that traffic via the API, but even at Delicious, it was, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 API to web access. And you cannot rely on people being nice. So I mean, you have to be able to drop requests at the perimeter, because otherwise you may wind up spinning up a lot of compute resources for somebody who just comes along and hits you really hard. So I think even if you don't go with a vendor, having something that lets you drop requests fairly far out is a good thing to be doing ahead of time.
And of course, and depending on your priorities as an organization. You wind up having to streamline what you can offer. Again, for us, we try to make as much information available to as many people in as many ways as possible. But obviously, as we've grown quite rapidly in terms of traffic, we've had to be very careful about opening up new services and things, because of the assumption at this point that they are going to take a massive amount of traffic immediately. So it does take more effort and consideration in doing that work.
Does creating an API help sort of implant you in an ecosystem to the point where, startups a lot of time, I mean, the reason why companies go out of business is because they run out of cash. But there are some instances, like we saw a lot of questions about URL shorteners, where what happens if they go out of business because other people are depending on them for links. Are APIs a way to sort of get your, plug into the system in such a way that so many people depend on you that it almost becomes like a little bit of a safety net that people can't afford to have you go out of business?
What happened to that URL shortener? You guys made some risky offer, right?
Yeah. Obviously, we kind of internally, we have, a really simple set of priorities, and number one being that, everything must redirect at all times without fail. Guiding principle from the start was, reliability, uptime, availability, things like that. So obviously we take great pains to keep things up. But for us, to the point that API, I would say not really, because for us, the API and actual click traffic are really two sides of the same coin. You could actually look at the click traffic as another API endpoint, right? If something, expanding a URL is the same as somebody redirecting. So for us, it's an aggregate product, and we kind of look at it the same way. But I would say though that once you have significant API uptake and you have customers who you realize are relying on you, for functionality they're implementing or features they're looking to offer, you have additional responsibility. And that goes beyond Bitly, and just to any site. If you have a normal site, especially if you consider a content-driven site, and it goes down, you inconvenience people who are visiting your site. If you have an API that people are making heavy use of, API fails, you're inconveniencing people who have taken time and effort to build their own audiences and sites and provide features to their own users.
Let's go down the row in terms of relationships with people who are using it. What promises or service level agreements or anything have you made attached to the API? Do you basically say we'll be up or not, or do you take any sort of responsibility in terms of service level, or it's just basically kind of a free for all for whoever wants to take use API at your own risk?
Well, for us, I mean, again, our overriding principle is uptime at all costs, and we have layers of redundancy built in. So even if certain functionality fails, we can continue to redirect. We can continue to provide service and things along those lines. From our perspective, if we couldn't provide those services, we wouldn't be here. So it's
best efforts, but really it's to your advantage to have it up, but not necessarily any kind of promises or agreement.
No. I mean, obviously there are no enterprise SLAs or anything like that, but it is the founding principle essentially.
Yeah, I mean, our API doesn't really guarantee any kind of uptime, and it's limited in terms of number of requests you can make. But it's basically at this point for us, it's the API is experimental, which is the truth is we would go out of our way to make sure everything works great, but there's no way we can put any kind of like legal speak bounding us, and I don't think anyone would do. And on that note, even if you look at sort of APIs that do guarantee uptimes, I mean, people were kind of vocal on Twitter about Amazon going down, and how come Amazon doesn't have SLAs, or it has SLAs but it went down. Well, the point is, you may have an SLA, it doesn't matter, you'll still go down. So it's kind of little comfort. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that if you are building on somebody else's API, even if they give you an SLA, it usually doesn't have any teeth, right? I mean, it usually says, hey, you don't have to pay us, or something like that, or maybe if they're really generous, we'll refund you the month's fee if there are fees involved. But your service is still down if it's a crucial bit. So relative to the damage, I think you need to make your decisions much more on what you think the actual uptime expectations are, rather than saying, hey, I've got an SLA. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh,
so you have
that's
a slightly different relationship with your.
Yeah, we
have
fight
paying
about this all the
customers.
time, actually. So we have paying customers, we have SLA agreements with our customers. We have to make them we have a big dependency on network data. And network data, guess what, is not even 5 nines, it's not even 4 nines, it's not even 9s, right? So, we do our best to, say, hey, we have a dependency on this, but other than that, if you measure us on our SLA, we're trying to be 5 nines of uptime.
And you're kind of on both sides of the coin, because you're depending on other people for data, and then passing that off to other people who depend on you.
Right,
So
exactly.
sort of-
And sometimes crap data comes through, and sometimes, it just doesn't come through. So, there is a value added layer that we're doing to, clean that data and make sure it comes through okay.
So let's talk about the risk of building on top
It
of it.
was, I don't know, did you want to?
Yeah, we can make some questions.
Yeah, sure, question.
So my question was, hi, I'm Tom, I work for Yahoo. My question was, for like a lot of traditional other things like hosting, when you have an SLA, it's like very upfront. It's like, when you buy our hosting, you buy these factors into your SLA. We have all of these kind of things that we promise you. It seems like web services mostly you don't share information about how you're guaranteeing your SLA. So if I say this is my SLA, nobody says we've got BCP. Nobody says these are the things that we're doing to show you, our customer, that we can really back up our SLA. And is that something that you feel people should do or will change?
Well, I think it's a big difference between some of the sort of, playful consumer things where if they break, nobody will get injured, and something like Christine, where you've got paying customers. What do you guys do in terms of?
In terms of retribution for downtime?
Or in terms of disclosing what you're doing to
Right.
achieve uptime?
So this is a typical enterprise sale. There's lots of things that we have to disclose about uptime and how we're monitoring it, and we have to come to agreement. Some customers, right now the service is so new, most customers don't care, right? But at some point, I know, because I've been through this before in a previous life, they're going to ask for exactly what you're doing to keep uptime, and they're going to want to agree on exactly the network monitoring tool that says you're up or down and so forth. And then, of course, the retribution is payment, right? So we're not going to pay you if you're down.
Right.
So let's talk about some of those risks. You talked about companies that you're seeing and have invested in that depend on other people's APIs. How much of a risk factor is that, or is that just one of many risks that sort of startups have? And what are some of the discussions you have with people in terms of how much they're depending on other people in the stack?
I would say from an investment perspective, I think we will try to separate kind of the technical risk you're incurring with the long-term business risk. So it ties back to the earlier question, which is, if you are doing something on top of somebody else's API and we feel you're not really adding any value to what they're doing, that's a much bigger concern. We'll spend more time on that than on the technical side, generally speaking.
I mean, I can add that we use, we probably use a dozen different APIs to power Glue, and it's been an interesting experience where I started sort of like with just the Amazon Web Services, and they work pretty much all the time. And recently, we've had kind of like more hiccups, and it's sort of, my philosophy is, if you don't kind of like notice, if it doesn't feel often enough, then it's okay. But when it kind of starts being often enough, then you realize that you may have an issue. But to be fair, I think that all of these APIs are as stable as as any piece of software, and probably even more stable. Like all the Google APIs, Amazon APIs, Netflix APIs. I mean, they work pretty well. I mean, they have very low kind of faulting rate. So I would say it's probably not a huge risk, but it's a huge benefit, because we couldn't build Glue without remixing all of these APIs.
And does it matter if you're using a Google API versus an API that belongs to a startup that may not have enough funding to last more than 18 months? Does that factor in?
I think it's a critical consideration. Again, I think if you build on top of something and you have uncertainty about whether that something is going to be around, it puts a higher mandate on you to figure out what are possible alternatives to structure your code in a way that you could, rip out that service and plug something else in if that were necessary. Again, I think you have to really ask yourself, why am I using this? Why am I building on top of this? What am I getting here that I can't get elsewhere? And I think let me give a good example. there's a startup which has an amazing telephony API called Twilio. If you're not using it, you should. They're now rolling out SMS support also. We're not an investor. I just like Jeff a lot, and I think it's very cool what he's done. But they're a startup, and you're definitely taking the risk that they may not, that something might happen and they might not make it for whatever reason. So would I necessarily build a startup that is going to completely fail if Twilio fails? I think that's a big question mark. But if I have a startup that also wants to on the side, voice enable part of the application or SMS enable part of the application, and use Twilio to do that, and you write it in a way where if that fails, you could go to an SMS gateway provider or some other solution, then I think there's very, very low risk here. And then I think the other thing to consider is that just because an API comes from a large company doesn't mean it'll continue to exist. I mean, I don't want to pick on Yahoo here, but I was in the Boss session earlier, and Boss is a great API, but whoever presented from Yahoo said, I can't tell you what's going to happen to Boss. So I think that it's not just a question about startup versus big company. It's a question about what is the compelling support or reason for this API to continue to exist.
We actually ran into that issue at Path 101 because we're using the Boss API to call resumes off the web, and so that was a major. It's actually a major consideration for us as we were sort of trying to sell our company because we couldn't necessarily make the guarantee that one critical piece of the infrastructure wasn't ours, and we had to depend on some kind of guarantee.
So I'm full of questions. So I'm kind of curious, how commoditized do you think APIs are becoming? So for example, there's a Bing API, Google don't really have an API, but you can probably get most of their results anyway, and things like that. I mean, could you swap out APIs that you do or don't like really easily, or is that something where every API is a unique, beautiful butterfly and
It depends.
There's our butterflies.
Boss API is uniquely nice, and I wish we could use it, but we actually decided not to use it, and went with homegrown kind of Amazon simple DB based solution for exact same reason. But I think if you look at, like, for example, web search or image search or news search, those APIs are literally kind of, well, not dime a dozen, but there is quite a few alternatives. So Yahoo has one, Microsoft has one, Google has one. And going back to Albert's point, they're totally interchangeable. I mean, you actually don't even need to do a lot of work in terms of like wrapping them. If you have your own, search function, you can literally swap one REST call for another one, and you're done. So like you're not really locked into any particular one. So that's kind of good.
And that puts the onus on the provider, just to make sure that the results are better, the uptime is better, because that people can switch out at any time. Question?
I sort of wanted to comment on that for a second. I think that there's a very large difference between APIs that provide a service and APIs that give access to a network, right? So you could clone the Twitter API today, but if you're not part of the Twitter network, I wouldn't want to substitute your API for the Twitter API. If somebody, on the other hand, cloned Twilio's API and provided exactly the same services and quality, I could switch that from one to the other because there's no network that I'm attaching to. I'm just getting a service. So I think it's a vast difference. And I think it's probably true for you. You're getting very special data that you can only get from one place. So
Right. Well, kind of, right? So if we go out and we talk to, let's say, Metro PCS, which is a very low-end prepaid carrier, we get a bunch of data from them, the inherent qualities of that network of people are so vastly different from if we got data from Verizon, right? And so there's a careful balance there. And back to the power issue with big company, small company, we face this every day. We're tiny companies swimming around in a sea of sharks. These guys have a lot of negotiation power when they open up their API to anyone. And I'm sure everyone in this room who's ever tried to develop anything on the mobile networks or dealt with carriers or whatever, they can whip you around like crazy and flush you down the toilet after. And so we always have to try to play one off the other, and that speaks to, can we plug Metro PCS data in for Verizon data? No way. Can we plug AT&T data for Verizon data? Yes. And can we make these elephants dance with one another around the same circle? That's the trick.
Well, you bring up an interesting point too in terms of building up an internal expertise around dealing with other people's APIs. I mean, that's something that there's this guy down in Louisville, Rob May, who is building this thing called live stream backup, and it's a way to sort of back up your Flickr photos and all sort of stuff, which he thought was sort of a commodity service. But he found out that actually dealing with all of the underlying APIs to get that done, because they kept changing all of the time, and it was sort of a pain in the neck, actually. So it wasn't necessarily easy to just throw a software service on top of other people's APIs.
Yeah, it's not always obvious.
Question?
Yeah, do you find that there's any sort of deliberate effort, people that are providing, say, informational services, trying to make their APIs the same so that they are compatible, or the opposite, where people are trying to make their APIs distinctly different to make it more difficult for people to move around?
I think they just have to competitively provide the same data set. So like, let's say you go to Google or Yahoo or Bing and you do a search, kind of, it's pretty much the same data, just different skin. Well, not the same data, but to the large extent. I mean, I still think the Google data set probably like is better at this point, but you know, they're pretty much interswappable, but not because they're trying. And also they're kind of, you know, to Charlie's point, they're kind of like competing with each other, and you get to choose, so they kind of have to provide the same set of features. So that's definitely good for us as customers of those APIs.
I guess that's my point. There's sort of like a market in the APIs in particular fields.
I mean, to some extent, I think it's only natural for somebody entering an established field to attempt to mimic the API formats of an existing entry in the market. Just, you know, naturally, any developer who can swap one API for another without having to modify code, it's going to make, you know, the likelihood of adoption and uptake just, you know, not much more significant.